Welcome to Module 3, Part 2, the second module for this particular unit. And here we're going to talk about something I refer to as knowledge beyond culture. Actually, another writer came up with it, a writer who was writing a critique of postmodernism, but I like the term, and I've been using it in my classes. So knowledge beyond culture. So first of all, what is it, just in simple terms, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we produce knowledge beyond culture. First of all, knowledge beyond culture would be what we would properly think of as being, let's say, scientific knowledge, mathematical knowledge, knowledge obtained by empiricism, reason, logic, experimentation. In other words, things that are modes of thinking, epistemologies, if you will, paradigms that everyone, regardless of cultural background, has access to. So, how is this knowledge generated, and how does it differ from, let's say, cultural knowledge? In fact, the two types of knowledge I want to compare and contrast here are universal knowledge and cultural knowledge. We're going to compare and contrast these two point by point. In regard to universal knowledge, we can say that it's highly empirical and data-based. In other words, it's based on testing, observation, hypothesis testing, and things of that nature, falsification, experimentation, often which begins with the collection of data. Very, very important in regard to producing universal knowledge, because remember, it has to be something that everyone has access to. Everyone has access to data. Everyone has access to reason, experimentation, objectivity, hypothesis testing, etc. On the other hand, cultural knowledge is produced by tradition, mythology, ideology, and it involves, let's say, cultural truths. For example, the way that females are treated in one particular culture would be a result of cultural knowledge. The way that gays and lesbians are treated in a particular culture would be cultural knowledge. The way that one religion might be assumed to be the standard vis-a-vis all the others would be a result of cultural knowledge. So once again, tradition, mythology, even authority are the things that generate quote-unquote truth in regard to cultural knowledge. Okay, now back on the other side, the universal knowledge. Universal knowledge is objective, meaning that it deals with propositions, or in other words, statements that are falsifiable, meaningful statements that are falsifiable, and also statements that are testable by anyone. So the fact that this knowledge is objective means that it's culture-free, it's value-free, it's accessible to everyone, it's understandable to everyone. So Newton's laws of motion, Kepler's planetary laws, the basic principles of genetics, the Pythagorean theorem, etc. All of these things are understandable to everyone cross-culturally, and they're accessible to everyone cross-culturally. On the other hand, cultural knowledge is not objective. With cultural knowledge, you may get, for example, proclamations of the gods, or reasons such as, quote, well, we've always done it that way, unquote. So things like custom and tradition are important here, and this type of knowledge is not objective at all. In fact, it generally will not make any sense once you take it out of its cultural context. Consider, for example, the quote-unquote truths of Hinduism, all of which are eminently sensible on the Indian subcontinent, but a relatively hard sell anywhere else. Back on the other side of the table, with universal knowledge, both induction and deduction are important. Induction, of course, going from the small to the large, in other words, collecting data, crunching numbers, and coming up with some quote-unquote big idea that helps you understand the observations you've made. Deduction works the other way. You start with the big, quote unquote, go to the small. In other words, you take a theory and now you test it against the data. So induction and deduction, in fact, there's a two-way arrow between induction and deduction because science involves both. It goes back and forth constantly, all the time collecting new data, all the time testing the theories to the data. In regard to cultural knowledge, to be quite honest, data is not really that important, if it's important at all. Meaning that there are some ideas that simply stand the test of time simply because they haven't been critiqued. So, for example, a few of the rather strange ideas still floating around today: geocentrism, the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe. There are still apparently some flat earthers out there, believe it or not. Young Earth creationism, and that's an idea that's embraced by a significant number of Americans, amazingly enough. Young Earth creationism. And of course, any religious truth that's assumed by any member of one of the 10,500 different religions, generally speaking, is accepted on faith and not generally critiqued. There's generally no desire to critique it. It's simply assumed to be true. Back on the universal knowledge side, we have the rule of falsifiability. The rule of falsifiability simply says that a statement that is not falsifiable is meaningless. In other words, there has to be some way to test the statement. Otherwise, you are in the realm of fantasy and fiction, conjecture and assumption, etc. And of course, there are a lot of things that fall rightly in that area, but that would not make them meaningful statements. And so, a statement that in fact is not falsifiable is meaningless in the strict philosophical use of the term. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong or stupid or weird or whatever. It just simply means that we can never get to it. So our knowledge of it is uncertain and will remain uncertain. That's very important in regard to universal knowledge. Because in fact, as you probably know, science, for example, continuously attempts to falsify itself. That in fact is one of the primary features of science. Even long-held theories and ideas are constantly under attack, and people constantly attempt to falsify them. That in fact is the beauty of science, in my mind. There's a very strict filter in place to guard knowledge. Now back on the other side of the table, cultural knowledge, the rule of falsifiability simply is not relevant and simply does not apply. So for example, take religion, which is an example of cultural knowledge. Many of the major claims of the world's religions are simply not falsifiable. Again, that doesn't mean they're right or wrong. It just means we can never know this information the way we know other things about our world. So for example, the notion that Allah spoke to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel from the years 610 to 632 CE. The idea that the Buddha was born as a result of a virgin birth. The idea that Mahavira, the sort of spiritual founder of Jainism, survived on 1 grain of rice per day during periods of his life. In fact, any claim of any miracle that one might read about in any of the holy scriptures of the world's religions, these things are not falsifiable. Religious practitioners, of course, take them on faith, but that is precisely the problem. Because, for example, approximately 1.4 billion people totally accept the claim that Allah communicated some information to Muhammad, while basically the rest of the world, whether it be some 5.6 billion people, reject that claim. So that's universal knowledge as opposed to cultural knowledge. And universal knowledge is what gives us, quote-unquote, knowledge beyond culture, as you probably figured out by now. It's knowledge that transcends culture. So, for example, if you would go to Beijing, China, and take a chemistry class you would be learning the same concepts. If you were to take Algebra 2 in Tokyo, same concepts, same principles. You can say the same thing regarding genetics, human anatomy, biochemistry, astronomy. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. There's universal agreement regarding this knowledge. And so therefore refer to it as knowledge beyond culture. One thing that can be said for knowledge beyond culture is that it does temper cultural absolutism and ethnocentrism. So, for example, if one is inclined to believe that there's only one proper form of marriage between one man and one woman, and some might even add in the eyes of God, well, actually, in an absolute cultural sense, that is simply, well, I should say, in a universal sense, that is simply not true. It is simply not true. Reason being, there are many forms of marriage around the world that are embraced as standard and customary. For example, in Tibet, a woman marries a man and his brothers, a practice called fraternal polyandry. In some places in Africa, barren women might take on a wife and become, quote-unquote, the symbolic husband. So a kind of a same-sex marriage. So a barren woman can have a child. Also, too, in some African cultures, a woman may marry someone who's deceased. If that deceased male has died in a patrilineal culture and has left no heirs. And of course, polygyny, where one man takes on many wives, is quite common, quite popular around the world. Point being that knowledge beyond culture helps us really get at the essence of some notion, be it marriage, sexual orientation, which by the way looks very, very different from culture to culture, racism, etc. Cultural knowledge is thoroughly ensconced within one particular cultural view, whereas knowledge beyond culture gives us a look, a more sort of pan-human look at things. And as I said, you really get at the essence of what it means to be human with knowledge beyond culture, since it's a global sort of perspective. So what's important regarding this issue here? Well, biomedicine is based on knowledge beyond culture. And for that reason, I would say that biomedicine, while it's not strictly empirical and strictly scientific, and other forms of medicine, other forms of ethnomedicine, for example, have plenty of things to offer, and we have definitely learned from them. Nevertheless, I, like most scholars, believe that biomedicine is the most effective at treating healing and sickness as a whole. Now, there are some things that other medical systems do better. Like, for example, for whatever reason, in India and Africa, and some of the tribal indigenous cultures, they can better deal with schizophrenia than we can here in the West. You're going to read about that in the Han textbook. But nevertheless, all told, probably easily the most reliable medical system in existence today, primarily because it's based on knowledge beyond culture.